Hey, welcome back to Coaching Through the Bible. This week, Parshat Va'era, the second Parsha, the second section in the book of Exodus. And this week, our focus is expectations and excuses. Why is it that we often set low expectations for ourselves? Why do we do that? And a related question is, well, why do we make excuses for ourselves in all these different situations? And how do we sort of learn that out from the Bible this week specifically? And, what do we do about low expectations or excuses that we set? And so I want to look at this week a section regarding Moses and a particular thing that Moses brings up once last week and twice this week, or according to Rashi, the famous commentary, once last week and once this week, except that it's mentioned twice this week. And the notion that Moses is not able to speak. There are a lot of explanations in the commentaries through the centuries as to what that means exactly. What was the impediment? What was that disability? What was Moshe's problem with speaking? And I want to offer maybe perhaps a slightly alternative approach to it based on our questions about expectations and excuses. Because once Moses mentioned it last week, and then he goes to Pharaoh, his failing at the house of Pharaoh, in front of Pharaoh in that court, is not his ability or inability to speak. In fact, we learned that the idea is that he's going to go and Aaron's going to go with him and Aaron's going to be speaking. So bringing it up again is a little bit interesting. And so when it is that he brings it up again here in the 6th chapter, verse number 12, he brings it up in the context even further that, well, the people aren't going to listen to me, and they're not going to listen to me. Certainly Pharaoh is not going to listen to me, and I am someone who has a problem speaking. And what's interesting also beyond that is that God's response takes about 20 verses and does not appear to be a direct response to Moses' problem. And yet after that, the truth is, we never hear about it again. That at the end of the 20 verses, as I mentioned before, the Rashi comment that when it is mentioned again at the end of that section, it's only simply returning back to this first statement. We never again hear about the idea that Moses has a problem speaking. And for the next 3, almost 4 books of the Bible, Moses speaks a lot to God, to the people. And we never hear that they have a problem understanding him, or that there's some sort of an impediment, or there's a requirement that Aaron speak on his behalf. It seems to almost go away. It doesn't mean that physically it went away. It could be that it did. And it doesn't mean that it was never a problem. It could be that it was. But as an excuse, or as a reason as to why it is that they will not succeed in their task to go to Pharaoh, that goes away. It does not appear that Pharaoh has any problem understanding Moses, or conversing with him, or arguing with him, or disagreeing with him. And so it's an interesting thing that it's there and that it's there again. And then exactly what is God's answer? And then related to our question as to why do we make excuses? And it appears that what Moses is doing with the inability to speak, he's using it as an excuse as to why it is that the people won't listen to him, or why it is that Pharaoh won't listen to him if the people don't listen to him. So why would we do that? Why would he have an excuse like that? Why would he set up an expectation level, almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, that he's going to fail and people aren't going to listen to him, and setting the bar lower? And we do that also. And the question is, why do we do that? And so we make excuses for a whole host of reasons, because we have fear, we have self-doubt, we sense some sort of a dissonance between what we have to accomplish and who we are and where we are. And on some level, in the different literature, it's our ability to lie to ourselves to soothe our emotional well-being by telling us a different tale, or by telling us some sort of an explanation that frees us of our obligations or our responsibilities. To take it even a step further, there are really two specific kinds of excuses that we bring that help us then set expectations lower. There's an idea that I saw in literature called self-handicapping, which seems to connect deeply to what Moses is doing. It helps us sort of stem our anxiety about deeper issues or our desire to protect ourselves from any sort of shame or embarrassment or potentially failure. And perhaps the one that might make the most sense here is that we often excuse ourselves because of some sort of imposter syndrome that we might feel, or imposter phenomenon that we might feel. And a lot of literature on that subject that many of us, in fact, the majority of us, 70+% according to the research, will experience some sort of imposter episode in our lives. The idea that though we are successful, highly successful in many cases, that we believe ourselves to be frauds or phonies, that it's almost pathological in the idea that we are actually self-damaging and self-destructive and hurting ourselves by believing ourselves and perceiving ourselves as imposters. And the imposter syndrome is very powerful, and it comes from a whole host and a whole set of root causes, surroundings and environment, stereotypes, community of like-minded individuals, people who surround us, the idea also for ourselves that we have to be perfect and that we cannot ever fail. And so imposter syndrome seems to be quite appropriate. In fact, in the book called Moses and the Journey to Leadership by Rabbi Dr. Norman Cohen, he mentions that in Moses' conversation with God, and specifically this idea of him being unable to communicate with the people, Moses feels like an imposter. Quoting, "He is a mere shepherd who believes he cannot find the words to convince the people to follow him. He pleads with God, 'I have never been a person of words, either in times past or now. I am slow of speech and slow of words.'" The irony of that is not lost on us because Moses becomes one of the great orators ever. And so we think about it and we realize that Moses, perhaps, in offering the excuse or the explanation or the reasoning that he is ill-equipped to do this, is helping to set the expectation level lower. He's helping to set the bar lower for what's to be. And why? And so this gets into the deeper part as to why it is that we set the expectation lower and why we do set excuses to help us soothe our expectations, is because the truth is we make a false correlation and a false connection between who we are and the expectation level we need to set. Moses has some sort of an assumption that to be the leader of the people of Israel, to be the one to lead them out of Egypt, that one need to be able to communicate flawlessly already in advance of taking the role. That at that point already he should be polished and ready to lead rather than simply the one who goes forward and does. That's often the case with ourselves. We have a disconnect between the expectation level we set and the person, in fact, that we are. And so that comes about actually very beautifully in a beautiful explanation that I heard from Rabbi Aryeh Leibowitz in a sermon he gave more than a decade ago, which I happily remembered. He quotes a source written by Rabbi Yosef Nehemiah Kornitzer, who was the last chief rabbi of Krakow before the war. And it's the idea that the 20 verse interlude is the answer that God gives to Moses about his inability to speak. And it's as follows. God says to Moses, "Moses, if it was true that you were just an average person, if it was true that I was simply choosing an average person to do this role, then your excuse, your explanation, or your reasoning for your inability to succeed would be okay. And if it was true that the people you were trying to rescue were low-level people. We're not a people of destiny. We're not a people with a future. Then it would be okay. If they were actually slaves, then it would be maybe palatable. But the truth is, Moses, look in those verses. You are the son of kings. You are children of royalty, not just you and your brother, that you come from the tribe of Levi, but all of the people are princes and princesses, kings and queens. Royal blood running through them with a moral and gigantic eternal mission that cannot be housed or lived or accomplished by slaves. They are not slaves. They may yet toil as slaves at the moment, but they're not slaves. And neither are you. And so when it is the case that God explains to Moses that you are higher and bigger and greater than the limitations and expectation levels that you set for yourself and the excuses that you grant for yourself, it is that one, he realizes that he can actually do this, and the imposter syndrome fades and the excuses disappear. Because when you set the expectation level higher because you understand who you actually are, so then the excuses disappear. That doesn't mean that a person no longer has any fears or doubts or concerns or anxiety or stress. It simply means that they're willing to walk with them and go through with them into the future. The imposter syndrome doesn't actually necessarily go away. It's acknowledged and slightly moved to the side. In the literature on imposter syndrome and on excuse making, there are a lot of different excuses that we make. Some are legit and some are not legitimate. Sometimes we make an excuse because the longer term benefit of the excuse is actually better for us, or that our performance will improve that second or third time after we actually have made the excuse. But for the most part, excuses are detrimental to our health, they're detrimental to our being, they're detrimental to our success in life. And it doesn't actually ultimately reduce the anxiety, stress, or pressure that we actually feel. And so what happens with all these different things is that it's important that we get to the following space. Overarching, we're looking to seek alignment or congruence between our values, beliefs, and our actions. And when it is that our values and our beliefs, both about ourselves and about what we want to accomplish in life, align with our actions, sort of the imposter feeling fades away. I recently heard a talk by a CEO of an enormously successful corporation who says that every time he gets up to speak publicly, he feels that at some moment they're going to pull the curtain and everyone's going to realize that he's an imposter. But he's fairly young, and that he was attending an event and he was sitting next to a person who was 30, 40 years his senior, and he mentioned to him that he felt like he didn't belong. And the senior person said, "Oh, it's not just me." Meaning that is the case that as the person grows and continues to live and go through life, that the imposter piece doesn't necessarily go away. But it's simply the idea that it's there and we acknowledge it, we accept its presence, we move it to the side. Or that we share with others and we seek similar in others. When we hear it, it's almost a version of misery seeking company and getting comfort in the company of the others who feel that sort of sense of excuse or imposterness. But if we then try to reframe our thoughts and the idea that we need to be perfect or we need to have compare ourselves to others who might in that situation do X or Y or Z, and we frame our mind from comparing to learning from and not comparing to, then it's easier for us to operate and to act. And the truth is ultimately that the experience of the moment need not stop us. We need not necessarily have to feel like the imposter goes away, but we simply need to put ourselves in a position with the tools that we have and the experience that we have and remind ourselves perhaps that in the past we have done this successfully, because imposterness is not necessarily about not having succeeded. It's about having succeeded and overcome, but feeling that the imposterness comes from chance or luck or some sort of amazing moment of clarity without any skill or competence. Then it is that we can set the expectation level higher. We can have a higher version of ourselves in our minds. We can reduce or minimize and free ourselves of the excuses, and ultimately then free ourselves of the anxiety and the stresses that come along with it by virtue of the fact that appreciating that everyone feels that sense of impostorness, even Moses. But ultimately, they go on that journey, they go on that path, they do the things it is that God asks of them, that life seeks of them, that their mission requires of them, and they lead a very happy, successful, and beautiful life. And so when we think about our excuses and our expectations, let us for a moment think about Moses in that moment. Let us realize that it goes away, even if it doesn't actually go away, that we can overcome it, that we can surpass it, and that we can continue and succeed in every conceivable way, and even beyond when we set the expectation level higher. Have a great weekend. Shabbat Shalom. Look forward to seeing you in the next week of Coaching Through the Bible.